in the shadowy depths of history's darkest archives.
Los Angeles was a city shimmering in neon light. The Olympics had just dazzled the world. Reagan's America preached prosperity, and late-night TV promised laughter before bed. Families locked their doors, switched off their sets, and drifted into dreams of a brighter tomorrow. But in the shadows of that same city, another story was unfolding. A story without laughter. A story where the line between sleep and death was the thin wood of a bedroom door. Imagine it. You're in your own bed, ceiling fan humming softly above, when the sound of glass breaking jolts you awake. Footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, cross your living room. And then, silence, until your door creaks open. What if the last thing you saw in this life was the glint of a blade? Or worse, the dull gleam of an axe descending in the dark. This was the reign of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. But this series is not about myth-making. It's about dismantling the terror piece by piece. The psychology of a predator who mixed sex, Satan, and slaughter. The panic that turned a sprawling city into a cage of fear. And the footprints, literal and figurative, that led to his downfall. Welcome to The Night Stalker, Acts of Terror. Los Angeles, 1984. The city pulsed with a restless kind of confidence. Palm trees lined boulevards shimmering with headlights. Pastel suits and shoulder pads strutted through malls. And the music, synth-heavy, neon bright, poured out of radios in every convenience store. It was a city obsessed with the future, the West Coast dream, where the good life felt just within reach. But dreams don't silence the night. Behind the glossy magazine covers and Olympic glory, neighborhoods stretched endlessly, suburbs pressed against deserts, bungalows leaning against freeways. In those homes, locks were flimsy, windows cracked for summer air, and trust was a quiet religion. Los Angeles was big enough to believe you were safe simply because you were lost in the crowd. That illusion was about to shatter. The first victims didn't know they were making history. They were ordinary Angelenos, grandmothers, children, working men, who lived without bodyguards, without gated communities. They kept their doors open to the breeze, their only mistake. Living in the path of a man who thrived on randomness, who chose victims not for who they were, but for where they slept. Richard Ramirez. The name would become legend, but in the beginning he was no one. Just another drifter drifting under California heat. Tall, rail-thin, hair hanging wild across his shoulders, teeth rotting, eyes that never blinked when they should. He moved like smoke. Hard to see, harder to catch. By day, he disappeared among the addicts and the forgotten. By night, he became something else. A shape pressed against your window. A shadow listening to your breath. The terror began quietly. It was a July night when glass shattered in a modest East LA home. The neighborhood had long since gone to sleep, streetlights humming faintly in the silence. Inside, a woman stirred at the sound, thinking perhaps a cat or a drunken neighbor stumbling too close. But the sound of footsteps crushed that hope. Heavy, certain, moving across her living room. She sat up in bed, listened, heart pounding. Then the door creaked. What she saw was not a burglar. It was something worse. A man, tall and dark, standing in her doorway, the smell of sweat and rot curling into the air. In his hand, not a gun, not a knife, but something brutally ordinary, an axe lifted casually, as though it were an extension of his arm. The axe descended. What followed was chaos and silence, a life extinguished in seconds. No warning, no pattern, just the raw fact. Anyone could be next. The police report that morning read like any other. Forced entry, homicide, weapon recovered. But what it didn't capture was the ripple effect. The way the crime seeped into the neighborhood's lungs. For the first time, families triple-checked their doors. For the first time, Angelenos whispered that maybe the city wasn't as safe as it seemed. Ramirez knew it. He fed on it, because this wasn't about money, not really. He stole, yes, jewelry, wallets, whatever he could grab on the way out. But theft was the appetizer. The true feast was fear. Ramirez wasn't hunting people. He was hunting the feeling of domination, of watching terror dawn in someone's eyes. The axe, the knife, the gun, they were interchangeable. The ritual was what mattered, and ritual it became. Each attack felt random, yet it followed a rhythm only he understood. Late at night, homes chosen on impulse, victims across every age and race. A grandmother beaten as mercilessly as a child. He was not hunting types. He was hunting humanity itself. Detectives struggled. There was no pattern to build a profile on, no clear motive to map. This was not organized crime. This was not a jealous lover or an insurance scam. This was chaos given human form. Chaos that left behind footprints, blood, and silence. The LAPD at the time was already overwhelmed. Gang violence, drug wars, a city stretching far beyond their manpower. Adding a phantom killer into the mix felt like a cruel joke. A handful of detectives began to notice similarities. The brutality of the attacks, the signs of sexual assault, the casual use of whatever weapon was at hand. But they didn't yet know they were chasing the same man. They didn't yet have a name. Meanwhile, Los Angeles kept breathing, kept sleeping. Families said their prayers, kissed their children goodnight, left their windows cracked against the heat. And the Night Stalker kept walking. He walked through streets that should have been empty. He walked past houses where televisions flickered with reruns of Cheers. He walked with purpose, his sneakers slapping against concrete, his eyes scanning for the next unlocked door, because he knew something the city didn't. Locks can be broken, glass can be shattered, and innocence, well, innocence is the easiest thing in the world to kill. This was only the beginning. The summer of 1984 was relentless in Los Angeles. Heat clung to the city even after the sun fell behind the San Gabriel Mountains. Air conditioners rattled in upstairs windows, ceiling fans hummed, and in the poorer districts, people left doors cracked open just to feel a breeze. It was a season of restless sleep. But for Richard Ramirez, restless sleep meant opportunity. He prowled in silence, his sneakers whispering over asphalt, his senses tuned to the smallest detail. The flicker of a TV still on, the glow of a porch light, the sound of a dog barking and then going quiet. He was a predator who understood one simple truth. Safety was only an illusion, and Los Angeles had built its entire identity on illusion. The first door shattered on a quiet street in Glassell Park. The home belonged to a 79-year-old woman, Jenny Vinso. She had lived alone since her husband's death, a life measured in routine. Morning walks, coffee at the kitchen table, bedtime prayers. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't famous, she wasn't a target. She was simply there. Ramirez slipped inside like smoke. He moved through her kitchen, past photographs of grandchildren, past lace curtains that fluttered in the night air. He carried a knife this time, not the axe, but it didn't matter. The weapon was only an extension of the desire already burning in his mind. Jenny never stood a chance. By morning, a neighbor found her. The scene was brutal, beyond comprehension. The bed soaked, the body mutilated. Detectives arrived, their voices hushed as they took in the violence. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was something darker, something colder. They noticed details that would later become hallmarks. No sign of real planning, yet cruelty that seemed deliberate. The newspapers gave it little coverage at first. A murder in Los Angeles was hardly rare. But among the detectives, the case left a mark. They didn't know his name yet, but they felt it in their bones. Someone new had arrived. Someone who would not stop, and he didn't. Weeks later, another home. Another door forced open. Another family waking to the impossible. An intruder standing over them, eyes black and unblinking. The smell of sweat and decay filling the room. Ramirez wasn't careful. He wasn't organized in the way other killers were. He left behind fingerprints, footprints, sometimes even the weapon itself. But chaos was his camouflage. Police had so many crimes on their desks that his brutality drowned in the noise. To the victims, though, there was no confusion. There was only terror. A woman beaten and assaulted while her children slept in the next room. A man shot in his bed. Survivors spoke of a voice, low, raspy, almost gleeful, whispering threats they could barely repeat. Some said he invoked Satan, that he demanded they swear loyalty to the devil before sparing their lives. And soon, rumors began to spread. Los Angeles is a city built on stories, and this was a story too gruesome to ignore. Neighbors whispered about a phantom killer who slipped through windows, who left symbols of the occult, who struck at random. Parents pulled children off the sidewalks. Hardware stores sold out of locks and deadbolts. The nightly news, still cautious, began using words like night intruder. The name Night Stalker was still months away, but the identity was already forming in the collective imagination. Meanwhile, detectives wrestled with a dilemma. Was this one killer, or many? The city had always seen violence. Gangs, drugs, revenge killings. But these attacks felt different. The randomness was the pattern. There was no motive to follow, no profit to trace, only savagery. Detective Frank Salerno, already seasoned from years on the force, found himself circling these cases. He had built his reputation on catching killers who hid in plain sight. But this case gnawed at him differently. He looked at the photographs, beds soaked in blood, walls smeared, victims posed in ways that spoke of ritual. Something about the crimes seemed almost performative, as if the killer wanted the city to see, to tremble. Salerno wrote in his notes, "This one won't stop. He'll keep going until we drag him out of the dark. But dragging him out would prove harder than anyone imagined, because Richard Ramirez thrived in the dark. He knew the city's sprawl was his shield. He knew that fear itself could do half his work for him. And he knew something even worse. He liked it. The killings weren't just acts of violence. They were fuel, proof of his own power. Each break-in left him hungrier. Each terrified scream was a confirmation. And Los Angeles began to change. Entire neighborhoods started living like fortresses. Families slept with hammers by their beds, guns on their nightstands, dogs chained to bedroom doors. Yet none of it felt like enough. Because how do you stop someone who chooses randomly, who can as easily break into a mansion as a bungalow? The city was learning a cruel lesson. Crime statistics mean nothing when terror has a face, or worse, when it has no face at all. That summer, Los Angeles stopped being the city of angels. It became the city of fear. The murders of 1984 bled into the summer of 1985 like a slow fever. Los Angeles was already restless, sweltering nights, crime headlines stacked on breakfast tables, but few knew a predator had escalated. The randomness had turned ritual, and in a modest home, one of the most chilling signatures would be carved not with words, but with steel. It began with the sound of wood splintering. A bedroom door, flimsy and painted white, gave way under the blunt head of an axe. The crash was enough to yank its occupants awake. For one paralyzed moment, they thought it must be a break-in, a burglary gone violent. But what they saw next crushed any hope of survival. Richard Ramirez stood in the threshold, his silhouette jagged against the faint hall light. Tall, thin, hair wild around his face, and in his hands, the axe. It wasn't clean or quick. Ramirez swung with a kind of chaotic precision, hacking not to kill swiftly, but to maim, to terrorize, to savor. The sound echoed down the hallway, the heavy thud of steel striking flesh, the muffled cries cut short. For neighbors later interviewed, it was the sound that haunted them most. One described it as wood being chopped in the middle of the night. When police arrived, the scene was carnage. The walls splattered, furniture overturned, the weapon itself abandoned, as if Ramirez had no need to hide it. The axe sat on the floor, soaked, waiting for fingerprints no one had yet thought to dust. Detectives stood in stunned silence. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't an act of desperation. It was slaughter. Brutality elevated to something almost ceremonial. And it was here, staring at the warped doorframe and the blood pooling beneath it, that they began to realize. The killer was choosing ordinary objects, axes, knives, cords, even bare hands, and turning them into instruments of horror. What unsettled them most wasn't just the violence, it was the indifference. Most killers, even the most vicious, have a pattern, a type of victim, a motive that can be mapped. Ramirez shattered that rule. Here was a man who could walk into a home with nothing more than what he found inside: an axe resting in the garage, a knife in the kitchen drawer, and transform it into a weapon of ritual. He didn't bring tools of death. He found them along the way. That randomness, that improvisation, was its own kind of terror, because it meant anyone could be next, with anything in their home turned against them. Detective Frank Salerno lingered at the scene longer than most. He was a man accustomed to crime, hardened by decades of chasing killers, but something in this case gnawed at him. He wrote in his field notes, "The axe. This is no accident. It's theater." He wants the city to know him through the tools of their own lives. And perhaps that was Ramirez's cruelest trick, to use the ordinary against the ordinary. A lock pried open, a window slipped through, a household tool repurposed. He wasn't just breaking into homes. He was breaking into the very concept of safety. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Fear is contagious, and the details of this particular murder were too gruesome to contain. Soon, whispers reached across Los Angeles. The killer with the axe. Parents pulled their children in early, kept lights burning all night. Hardware stores sold out of door braces, iron bars, anything that could hold back the swing of steel. But Ramirez was already gone, slipping through the night to another district, another victim. He moved with no pattern but his own desire. Sometimes he carried a gun. Sometimes he carried nothing at all. The randomness was the point. He wanted the city to feel what his victims felt, that nowhere was safe. That terror could come from any angle, at any moment, with any weapon. In the days that followed, journalists caught wind of the brutality. Reports began using darker language, Not burglary, not homicide, but slaughter. And soon, another element crept in. Rumors of satanic rituals. At some crime scenes, Ramirez had scrawled pentagrams, whispered words invoking the devil. Survivors spoke of being forced to swear to Satan under threat of death. The axe was only the beginning. The true horror was the ideology he carried with him, twisting fear into something almost religious. For Los Angeles, the murders were no longer isolated events. They were chapters in a story being written in blood. And the story had just introduced its most terrifying symbol, the ordinary axe, wielded with extraordinary cruelty. Detective Salerno would later admit, in private, that the axe haunted him more than the guns or knives. Guns were common in LA, knives too. But an axe? That was primal. That was medieval. It was a reminder that Ramirez wasn't just killing, he was sending a message, and the message was clear. Nothing in your home is safe. Not even the objects meant to build, to shelter, to protect. Fear has a way of inventing its own language. In Los Angeles, 1985, that language began to take on a darker vocabulary, symbols, whispers, and shadows that reached far beyond the ordinary terror of a home invasion. It started with survivors. A woman, trembling as she spoke to detectives, described how the intruder had forced her to repeat the words, "I swear to Satan," while he assaulted her. Another survivor recalled the man's eyes flashing with a strange kind of glee as he etched a crude pentagram on her wall. For her, the words burned even louder than the violence. Hail Satan! These were not just murders anymore. They were proclamations. Detectives, hardened by years of blood and brutality, found themselves unnerved. Crime was supposed to be transactional, greed, revenge, jealousy, but this was something else, something ideological. It wasn't about taking life for profit. It was about taking life for a god, or perhaps for a devil. The city began to buzz with rumors. Reporters picked up scraps of testimony, spinning headlines that tied the murders to satanic ritual. It was, after all, the 1980s, an era when America was gripped by a moral panic about cults and the devil himself lurking in suburbia. From daycare centers accused of ritual abuse to heavy metal records blamed for corrupting the youth, Satan was already a household fear. Now, here in Los Angeles, that fear had a face. Richard Ramirez fed on that panic. He didn't need a cult. He was the cult. Each crime scene became a sermon, every mutilation a twisted scripture. He wanted the city to tremble not just at his presence, but at the presence he claimed to serve. Detective Frank Salerno studied the pentagrams with a mixture of disbelief and dread. He was no stranger to theatrics. Killers often played games, left messages, and tried to shock investigators. But this was different. Ramirez wasn't taunting police. He was invoking something larger than himself. Salerno wrote in his notes, "This man doesn't just want to kill. He wants to terrorize on a spiritual level. He wants them to believe the devil walks with him," and many did. Churches filled with anxious worshipers, candles lit in quiet desperation. Clergy spoke from pulpits about the battle between good and evil now spilling into their neighborhoods. Some parishioners whispered that they had seen the killer's shadow on their streets. Parents warned their children not only about strangers, but about signs of Satan in everyday life. The paradox was chilling. Ramirez was a man of chaos, sloppy, often leaving fingerprints, footprints, DNA. Yet the myth forming around him painted him as untouchable, almost supernatural. And that myth was perhaps his greatest weapon. One night, in a quiet neighborhood, a young couple woke to the sound of their window shattering. Ramirez entered like a shadow, gun in hand. He shot the man instantly, leaving him lifeless beside his wife. Then he turned to her. What followed was not just violence, but theater. He forced her to swear allegiance to Satan, to declare words she had never uttered in her life. When detectives interviewed her later, her voice broke as she whispered, "It wasn't just him in the room. It felt like he brought something else with him." The newspapers devoured the story. "Satan killer stalks the night," one headline screamed. And the name Night Stalker began to stick, spreading from television anchors to whispered conversations in grocery store aisles. But beneath the panic, detectives clung to the tangible. They had evidence: the sneaker prints, the descriptions, the whispers of a rotting mouth and a gaunt frame. Still, they were chasing a ghost that the city had transformed into a demon. Ramirez, meanwhile, reveled in it. He began leaving pentagrams more boldly, drawn on walls, scrawled on victims' bodies, even carved into flesh. The devil was not just invoked, he was branded. Ramirez was no longer content to be a killer. He wanted to be a prophet of fear. Detective Salerno confessed privately to a colleague. "The hardest part isn't catching him. The hardest part is convincing the city he's just a man. Because right now, they think he's the devil himself. And in truth, it was hard to disagree." The killings were accelerating. The rituals more grotesque. Los Angeles no longer felt like a city under siege by a criminal. It felt possessed. By late summer, the Night Stalker had become something more than a headline. He was an urban legend still being written, a bogeyman who could slip through any crack, who demanded allegiance to hell itself. The whispers grew louder, until fear wasn't just about the man. It was about the darkness he claimed to represent. And in the shadows, Ramirez smiled. Because as long as the city trembled, he was winning. Detective Frank Salerno stared at the photographs spread across his desk. They came from different crime scenes, different districts, different families, different nights. But as he shuffled the images, a single detail kept tugging at him like a thread waiting to unravel. It wasn't the blood, or the broken windows, or even the victims. It was what the killer left behind when he walked away. Footprints, not just any footprints. A specific tread, wide-soled, almost new. In one photo, the print was smeared across a dusty tile floor. In another, pressed clearly into the soil of a flower bed. And in yet another, faintly outlined in blood by a victim's bed. The shape was consistent. A sports shoe, heavy, with a diagonal pattern across the heel. Salerno called in specialists. They measured, compared, and finally delivered the verdict. Avia sneakers, size 11.5. It was, in some ways, the break they had been waiting for. At last, a pattern in the chaos. But there was a problem. Avia was a small athletic brand, not as common as Nike or Adidas. Few stores in Los Angeles carried that model, which meant the shoe was rare, traceable potentially. But rarity was a double-edged sword. It meant if the police could find the buyer, they could narrow the suspect pool. But it also meant the killer likely knew his footprint would be unique. And yet, he didn't care. That was what chilled Salerno most. Ramirez wanted to leave footprints. He wanted the city to know he had been there. Each crime scene became a stage, and the sneaker print his autograph. It was the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. Meanwhile, Los Angeles was drowning in terror. The randomness of the crimes was becoming unbearable. A grandmother strangled in her kitchen, a 6-year-old abducted from her bedroom, assaulted, and left by a freeway. A couple tied up and forced to listen as Ramirez whispered prayers to Satan before executing one of them. Reporters swarmed precincts, demanding updates. The phrase "Night Stalker" blared from headlines. News anchors warned viewers to lock their windows, to install new bolts, to sleep with phones by their beds. Every neighborhood meeting turned into a council of fear. But Ramirez wasn't slowing down. He was accelerating. One victim later told police that Ramirez's breath was the first thing she noticed. A rancid stench, mixed with sweat and cigarettes. Then his voice, low and cruel. "Don't scream. Don't look at me. Just do what I say. Swear to Satan." Another survivor described the coldness of his eyes as he lifted his sneaker and pressed it deliberately onto her carpet, as though marking territory. He left her alive, but not untouched. She told detectives, voice trembling, "He wanted me to see it. He wanted me to remember the shoe." The Avia sneaker print became the thread detectives clung to. They circulated descriptions to other jurisdictions, checked with shoe distributors, tried to trace the limited sales. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and Ramirez moved quickly. Detective Salerno felt the pressure mount. He'd been here before. He was one of the men who had tracked the hillside strangler years earlier. He knew the weight of a city's fear, knew how it crushed investigators under impossible expectations. But this case was different. The hillside strangler had targeted a type. Ramirez had no type. The hillside strangler had hidden his movements. Ramirez left footprints like trophies. It was a paradox. How do you catch someone whose greatest disguise is his unpredictability? The only answer, by following the small consistencies. And the Avia sneaker was consistency incarnate. Behind closed doors, Salerno warned his team. He won't stop. He's testing the city, testing us. These shoes, this is our leash. Pull on it hard enough, and we might choke him. Meanwhile, Ramirez laughed in the dark. Each new attack was bolder. Sometimes he carried an axe, sometimes a gun. Sometimes he used nothing but his fists and teeth. He carved pentagrams on walls, left satanic symbols like breadcrumbs, and always, always, the shoes. For the people of Los Angeles, the shoes became mythic. Newspapers described the footprints of terror. Neighbors whispered about the demon sneakers. Parents told children to stay indoors after sunset because the Night Stalker was out there, and you could hear him in the sound of footsteps on the pavement. But myth and evidence are not the same. Detectives needed more. They needed a face, a name, a mistake. And though Ramirez was careless, he was also lucky. His trail cut across counties, spreading jurisdictional chaos. Evidence sat siloed in separate offices, dots unconnected. Still, the sneakers were waiting. One day soon, that tread would be matched to a man. One day soon, the phantom would be dragged into the daylight. But not yet. For now, Ramirez walked freely, his Avia shoes carrying him through the sprawl of Los Angeles. Step after step, print after print. A trail of fear etched into the city's skin. By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles was no longer a city that slept. Curtains stayed drawn, porch lights burned through the night, and the silence of the suburbs had turned into something else entirely, an absence of trust. Every sound after midnight could be him, every creak of wood, every bark of a dog, every passing shadow. The fear had a name now. It started with a headline. A reporter, desperate to sell papers, strung together two words that would live forever. Night Stalker. It was catchy, visceral. It painted Ramirez as a phantom who haunted the dark, a figure so powerful that even daylight couldn't erase him. By the time the evening news repeated it, the phrase had stuck. Ramirez was no longer just a killer. He was a character, a myth written in blood and ink. The nickname spread like wildfire. Talk radio raged with callers describing their fears. Television anchors warned families to lock their doors, as though locks meant anything at all. Housewives whispered about satanic rituals. Children drew crude pentagrams on school desks, imitating the monster the adults couldn't stop talking about. The Night Stalker wasn't just in the shadows. He was in their heads, and the media fed him. Every detail leaked from police files became a headline. The footprints, the pentagrams, the whispered "Hail Satan." Each revelation made the Night Stalker larger, more omnipresent, more terrifying. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a citywide obsession. For Ramirez, this was fuel. He had always been sloppy, leaving evidence, leaving witnesses. But now, with each front page, he understood something crucial. Fear was the real prize. Killing was only one piece of the ritual. Watching the city collapse under panic was the rest. Detectives hated it. Frank Salerno, already exhausted from months of sleepless nights, slammed a newspaper down on his desk. The headline screamed, "The Night Stalker strikes again." Salerno muttered, almost to himself, "We're not just chasing him anymore. We're chasing his shadow." Because the nickname wasn't just catchy, it was damaging. Citizens began flooding police lines with phantom sightings. Every tall man in black became a suspect. Every late-night drifter was reported. The LAPD and Sheriff's Department were swamped, drowning in paranoia. And Ramirez, meanwhile, slipped through the cracks, laughing in the dark. The frenzy reached absurd levels. Gun sales skyrocketed. Security companies couldn't keep up with demand. Families turned their homes into bunkers, steel bars across windows, multiple deadbolts, even makeshift traps. In some neighborhoods, men patrolled the streets with baseball bats and shotguns, forming vigilante watches. Yet none of it seemed enough. Because how do you fight someone who chooses victims at random? Who doesn't care if he leaves evidence? Who can turn a locked house into a coffin with one swing of an axe? One woman confessed to detectives that she had stopped sleeping entirely. She sat each night in a chair by her front door, clutching a frying pan like a weapon, praying she'd hear him before he came inside. Another man told reporters that he no longer let his children use the bathroom alone at night. Fear had invaded the most private corners of life, and Ramirez fed on it. At one crime scene, he left behind a message scrawled in lipstick, a pentagram smeared across a victim's body. At another, he forced survivors to declare their loyalty to Satan while he ransacked their home. These were not just murders. They were stage plays for an audience of millions, and the media was his perfect amplifier. Detective Salerno tried to remind his team, and himself, that Ramirez was just a man. His teeth were rotting, his hygiene wretched, his methods crude. He wasn't brilliant. He wasn't invincible. But tell that to a city that believed the devil himself was stalking their streets. In East LA, children began chanting a rhyme. "Lock your door, lock it tight. The Night Stalker comes at night." Parents tried to hush them, but the words stuck, echoing in playgrounds and alleys. The killer had become folklore while still alive. The media frenzy also exposed a dangerous irony. The more they reported, the more Ramirez learned about the investigation. He read his own press, devoured the details, adjusted when necessary. When police mentioned a shoeprint, he noticed. When they speculated about his methods, he shifted them. The city's obsession was feeding him intelligence, and still, the bodies piled up. By August 1985, Ramirez had committed dozens of break-ins, assaults, and murders. The exact number would never be agreed upon. At least 14 confirmed murders, many more suspected. But the precise tally didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Nowhere was safe. In Beverly Hills mansions, wealthy couples hired private security. In working-class neighborhoods, families huddled together in single rooms, too afraid to spread out across their own homes. The rich, the poor, the old, the young, Ramirez had erased the usual boundaries of crime. Everyone was prey, and the Night Stalker knew it. One survivor later recalled how Ramirez paused during an attack to sneer at her. Tell them the Night Stalker was here. It wasn't just violence anymore. It was branding. For the detectives, the case had crossed a threshold. They weren't just fighting a killer. They were fighting a myth that made him faster, slipperier, deadlier. Because when your enemy becomes a legend, every shadow begins to look like him. And Los Angeles, that sprawling neon city, was drowning in shadows. For weeks, detectives had been staring into the dark. They had footprints, they had bodies, they had whispers of Satan. But they did not have a face. The Night Stalker was a shadow moving across Los Angeles, unseen and uncatchable, until one woman lived to tell her story. She had been asleep when the window shattered. A hot summer night, the kind where you leave the curtains open just to feel the faintest breeze. But the breeze carried something else, a smell. Cigarettes, sweat, the acrid tang of decay. She opened her eyes, and he was there. Richard Ramirez. He loomed above her bed, tall and gaunt, his teeth rotting in his mouth, his eyes black and unblinking. He pressed his hand over her mouth and whispered a single phrase, almost gleeful. "Don't scream. Swear to Satan." She thought she was going to die. He bound her, assaulted her, rummaged through her drawers. But then, in a moment that felt almost casual, he left her alive. As if her terror was enough. As if sparing her was part of the ritual. When detectives arrived, she was trembling, half delirious with fear. But she spoke. She described him in detail. His lanky frame, his unwashed hair, the stench of his breath, the way his sneakers squeaked faintly on her floor. She remembered his voice, low and rasping, like gravel dragged across concrete. And most of all, she remembered his eyes. She said they were the eyes of someone who didn't care if you lived or died. Someone who wanted you to know that. Her description gave detectives their first real composite sketch. The artist worked carefully, line by line, until a face emerged. Sharp cheekbones, hollow eyes, stringy hair. When the sketch was released, it was like the city collectively gasped. The Night Stalker was no longer a phantom. He had a face. The survivor's courage did more than produce an image. It gave the investigation momentum. Suddenly, tips flooded in. People swore they'd seen him on buses, in diners, on street corners. Most were false alarms, but a few felt promising. The detectives finally had something to chase, and yet, the survivor's account revealed something even darker. Ramirez hadn't just assaulted her physically, he had toyed with her mind. Forcing her to swear allegiance to Satan wasn't an accident. It was part of his theater of terror. He wanted to blur the line between crime and ritual, to make his victims feel not just violated, but damned. Detective Frank Salerno studied her testimony with a grim jaw. In his mind, Ramirez was evolving. Each crime was bolder, more theatrical, more tied to a performance of evil. Salerno scribbled in his notebook, "He's feeding off the city's fear. The killings are almost secondary. The terror is the point." The survivor, meanwhile, struggled to reclaim her life. Reporters hounded her. Neighbors whispered. Strangers stared. She was alive, but in a city consumed by fear, survival came with its own punishment. She told police she felt Ramirez's eyes on her even when she slept. She woke at night convinced he had returned. Trauma had tethered her to him in ways she couldn't escape. Her story rippled through Los Angeles. People looked closer at the sketch. Mothers stared longer at men on buses. Husbands gripped their wives tighter, walking to the car at night. The Night Stalker was no longer an abstract force. He was a man, ugly, human, catchable, and yet, that humanity made him even more terrifying. Because if this was just a man, then any man could be him. The neighbor, the bus driver, the stranger in the grocery store aisle. Fear had expanded from the night itself into the faces of every unfamiliar man in Los Angeles. Ramirez, for his part, relished the exposure. He watched his sketch circulate, knowing he had become more than a killer. He had become infamous. He leaned into it, attacking again, leaving survivors deliberately, as if to say, "Tell them I was here. Tell them the Night Stalker is real." The survivor's voice had cracked the case open, but it had also deepened the terror. Because now the city wasn't just haunted by a nameless shadow. It was haunted by a face, thin, hollow, demonic in its ordinariness, a face that could appear at your window, a face you might pass on the street. And for detectives, the chase had shifted. They weren't hunting a ghost anymore. They were hunting a man who knew he was being hunted and who had no intention of stopping. Detective Frank Salerno bent low over the plaster cast, the edges still fragile, dust clinging to its grooves. He had seen hundreds of impressions before, tires, boots, heels worn thin, but this one carried a different weight. It wasn't just a footprint. It was a breadcrumb, an Avia sneaker, size 11.5. The same print had surfaced again and again, on dusty tile, in blood, in the flower beds outside violated homes. It was the one thread tying a web of chaos together. While Ramirez seemed random, his victims, his weapons, his neighborhoods, the shoes were not. They were his constant, his arrogance stamped onto every crime scene. The cast felt almost intimate, as though it held the ghost of Ramirez himself. Detectives passed it around carefully, each man tracing the tread with his eyes, committing it to memory. They all knew, if they found those shoes, they'd find the Night Stalker. But finding them was harder than it sounded. Avia wasn't Nike. It wasn't Adidas. It was a smaller brand, barely sold in Los Angeles. Investigators checked distributors, traced shipments, called sporting goods stores up and down California. The search revealed that only a handful of pairs had even been sold in the entire state. Somewhere in that handful, one pair belonged to Ramirez. The irony was suffocating. The killer had left behind a signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. And yet, the sprawl of Los Angeles made it nearly impossible to trace. The shoes could have been bought cash, secondhand, stolen. Forensic science in 1985 wasn't what it is today. DNA databases didn't exist, and shoe prints weren't entered into a system. The detectives had to do it the old way, canvassing stores, following rumors, waiting for Ramirez to slip. Meanwhile, he kept walking. Each night, the Avias carried him deeper into infamy. Survivors recalled the sound of his shoes scuffing across carpet, squeaking on linoleum, thudding against bedroom floors. One victim, still trembling as she gave her statement, said, "I couldn't look at his face, but I remember the shoes. They were the last thing I saw before he closed the door." Salerno began to think of the sneakers as Ramirez's accomplices. They weren't just footwear. They were weapons of terror, leaving behind prints like calling cards, evidence that mocked investigators with every new body. The press picked it up too. Headlines whispered about the demon shoes, the cursed footprints left behind by the Night Stalker. The public, starved for details, seized on the Avias as another dark symbol. Children dared each other to draw sneaker prints in chalk on sidewalks. Housewives checked their husbands' closets. One rumor claimed the devil himself wore the same shoes. For Salerno, the symbolism was noise. He didn't care what the city thought. He cared that for the first time, Ramirez was bleeding evidence. And if the shoes could lead to him, then the nightmare had a chance of ending. But the trail was slow, and Ramirez wasn't. In one attack, he left a print in blood so clear it might as well have been a signature. He had bludgeoned his victim, ransacked the home, and then, as if deliberately, stepped squarely into the pool of blood before walking out. Detectives later studied the photograph, each man silently wondering the same thing. Was it arrogance, or was it a message? To Salerno, it was both. Ramirez wasn't hiding. He was branding himself, and he was daring the city to catch him. The shoes became an obsession in the squad room. Salerno reminded his team at every briefing, "Follow the shoes, forget the chaos, forget the headlines. The shoes are the truth." But the truth was still just out of reach. Leads dried up. Distributors couldn't pinpoint a buyer. Witnesses remembered nothing useful. And the murders continued. Yet, something was shifting. For the first time, detectives had more than myth. They had a trail. Not a clear one, not a short one, but a trail nonetheless. And as Ramirez kept moving, the trail grew longer, clearer, undeniable. One evening, Salerno sat alone in his car outside a crime scene, the cast of the Avia print resting on the seat beside him. The city hummed in the distance, neon lights flickering across the skyline. He closed his eyes and pictured Ramirez walking, always walking, step after step, leaving behind the arrogance of those sneakers, and he made himself a promise. Those shoes will walk him straight into our hands. Detective Frank Salerno had chased killers before. He had stood over bodies, sifted through lies, stared into the eyes of men who believed life was theirs to take. But the Night Stalker was different. Not just because of the brutality, not just because of the satanic whispers, but because the hunt itself was breaking him down. It was August 1985, and Salerno hadn't had a full night's sleep in months. His phone rang at every hour. Another break-in, another corpse, another family shredded in the middle of the night. He would drive across Los Angeles in the dark, the city's endless sprawl blurring into sameness, every crime scene carrying the same echo. Windows shattered, doors kicked in, the smell of fear still hanging in the air. The burden wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Salerno found himself studying his own house differently. He double-checked the locks on his doors, closed the windows tighter, left lights burning in the hallway. His wife noticed the change. His children did too. At the dinner table, his mind wandered back to the crime scenes, to the faces of victims that could just as easily have been his own family. Other detectives felt it too. They worked in shifts, but the Night Stalker didn't. He struck at any time, anywhere, shredding the rhythm of the investigation. Every officer lived in a state of siege, waiting for the next call, the next horror. Some began drinking heavier. Others snapped at their families. The case was a parasite, feeding on them as surely as Ramirez fed on the city's fear. One night, after visiting yet another crime scene, this time a couple executed in their bed, Salerno sat in his car outside the station. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized himself. The lines in his face seemed deeper, his eyes hollow. He thought for a moment about quitting, about going home, letting someone else chase this ghost. But then he remembered the survivors, the trembling woman forced to swear to Satan, the children who had watched their parents die. He remembered the sneaker prints, bold and taunting, stamped into blood, and he clenched the wheel until his knuckles whitened. He couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until Ramirez was dragged into the light. The burden wasn't Salerno's alone. Younger detectives struggled under the weight of the case. One, after weeks of chasing dead leads, broke down in the squad room, slamming his fist against the wall. "He's always ahead of us. We're not hunting him. He's hunting the whole damn city." The press didn't help. Every failure was magnified. Every new murder headline painted the police as incompetent. Citizens demanded answers, demanded protection. Callers flooded hotlines with tips that went nowhere. Ramirez seemed omnipresent, his myth growing larger with each passing day. And the detectives were painted as powerless. In truth, they weren't powerless. They had the shoes, they had the sketch, they had survivors' voices, but the sheer volume of fear made progress feel like failure. Every night without an arrest was another night Ramirez might strike. And he did. Again and again. At home, Salerno's wife asked him one night, "What if he comes here?" He had no answer. He wanted to say the truth, that Ramirez could come for anyone, anywhere, and no amount of locks or guns would guarantee safety. Instead, he just squeezed her hand and told her to keep the lights on. In quiet moments, Salerno thought about Ramirez himself. He didn't see a genius criminal. He saw a man-child, filthy and sick, whose only power came from chaos. But chaos was powerful enough to cripple a city, and the detective knew that if he let himself hate Ramirez too much, if he let the disgust consume him, he'd lose focus. He couldn't afford that. Not when the city was counting on him. So he carried the burden. He carried it in his sleepless eyes, in the tension in his shoulders, in the distance growing between him and his family. The hunt for the Night Stalker wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about proving that the city still belonged to its people, not to the shadow that walked among them. But even the strongest men have limits, and Salerno was close to his. As Ramirez continued his rampage, the detectives began to realize something terrifying. The city itself was starting to fight back. Neighborhoods armed themselves, citizens patrolled their streets. The people of Los Angeles weren't waiting for the police anymore. And that meant when Ramirez finally slipped, it might not be detectives who caught him. It might be the city itself. By late August 1985, Los Angeles was exhausted. The summer heat pressed down like a curse, and the city's patience had snapped. Every newspaper screamed, "Night Stalker strikes again." Every family lived in siege. But then, something shifted. The city stopped waiting. It happened in East Los Angeles, in a working-class neighborhood where people knew each other's names, where kids rode bicycles down cracked sidewalks, where families gathered on porches in the fading light. Ramirez thought it would be just another stop on his trail of terror, another house to break into. another set of lives to extinguish. But this time, the city had learned. That morning, Ramirez boarded a bus after reading his own face in the newspaper. The composite sketch, now perfected and published, stared back at him from every front page. A man sitting nearby recognized him. Those hollow eyes, that gaunt frame. He whispered to the bus driver. Another passenger peeked again, then another. Within minutes, the rumor spread through the bus like fire. The Night Stalker is here. Ramirez felt the shift in the air. Paranoia was nothing new to him, but this was different. The stares lingered too long. He leapt off at the next stop, his nerves sparking. He could hear footsteps behind him, not detectives, not uniformed officers, ordinary people. He turned down a street, searching for escape. But everywhere he went, faces turned toward him. A man watering his lawn froze. A woman hanging laundry dropped her basket. Whispers grew into shouts. "It's him! The Night Stalker!" Panic surged through Ramirez. For the first time in months, the predator felt like prey. He tried to break into a car, smashing the window with a frantic fist, but hands grabbed him from behind. A man swung a metal pipe. Another lunged with bare fists. A crowd was forming. Dozens of neighbors pouring from houses, their fear boiling over into fury. Ramirez struggled, snarling, clawing, trying to flee. But the crowd swarmed him. They pummeled him with fists, with bats, with anything they could grab. The man who had once wielded axes and knives was now curled on the pavement, begging, bleeding. The call to police was almost an afterthought. Someone shouted, "We've got him! We've got the Night Stalker!" By the time officers arrived, Ramirez was barely standing, his face swollen, blood dripping down his chin. The crowd refused to let him go, their anger a decade of unsolved murders compressed into one beating. For detectives, it was surreal. After months of chasing shadows, the Night Stalker hadn't been captured by police strategy or forensic evidence. He had been captured by the people. The same city he had terrorized had risen up, turned on him, and dragged him into daylight. When officers shoved Ramirez into the back of the patrol car, he tried to glare, to summon the menace he once carried into bedrooms across Los Angeles. But the look faltered. The mask of Satan had slipped. What sat in the back seat was not a phantom, not a demon, but a broken man in handcuffs. Detective Frank Salerno watched the news with a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. He had promised himself the shoes would walk Ramirez into their hands. Instead, the people had done it. The predator's arrogance, his belief in his own myth, had brought him out into the open, and the city had devoured him. For Los Angeles, it was catharsis. Strangers embraced in the streets. Parents told their children the monster was gone. Fear didn't vanish overnight, but for the first time in months, the city exhaled. Yet beneath the relief lay a darker truth. Ramirez hadn't been beaten by justice. He had been beaten by rage. And in that moment, Los Angeles had shown a reflection of the violence he himself had wielded. The hunter had become the hunted, but in the ugliest way possible. Still, it was over. The Night Stalker was no longer a shadow in the dark. He was a prisoner, shackled and caged, or so it seemed. The first time Richard Ramirez was seen in handcuffs, the world didn't see the devil. They saw a man, bloodied, swollen, beaten by the very citizens he had terrorized. The predator who once slipped silently through windows was dragged through the front door of justice by ordinary people with nothing more than fists and fury. Yet even in chains, Ramirez refused to vanish into anonymity. When detectives fingerprinted him, his smirk returned. He knew the game wasn't over. His shoes, his teeth, his prints, all of it tied him to the carnage across Los Angeles. But Ramirez had never cared about evidence. He cared about spectacle. And now, for the first time, he had a stage larger than any crime scene: the courtroom. At his arraignment, reporters jostled for photographs. Ramirez raised his hand, flashing the pentagram carved into his palm. "Hail Satan!" he hissed, his voice rasping but clear enough to carry across the chamber. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, reporters scribbling furiously. Ramirez smiled. He had lost the streets, but now he owned the spotlight. Detective Frank Salerno watched from the gallery, jaw tight. To him, Ramirez was just filth, a drifter who had killed indiscriminately, a coward who hid behind the mask of Satan to excuse his sickness. But watching the cameras snap, the pens scratch, Salerno realized Ramirez had achieved what he wanted. He was no longer just a criminal. He was an icon of fear. The trial became a circus. Protesters gathered outside, some demanding justice, others bizarrely fascinated, almost worshipful. Letters poured in to Ramirez from admirers, women drawn to the darkness he embodied. It was obscene, Salerno thought. This man had butchered families, and now people were treating him like a rock star. Inside the courtroom, survivors testified, their voices shaking as they relived the worst nights of their lives. They spoke of the smell, the teeth, the voice that demanded they swear to Satan. They spoke of the sneakers, the axe, the gun. And always, they spoke of the eyes. Those hollow, merciless eyes. Ramirez listened, sometimes grinning, sometimes staring blankly, sometimes laughing under his breath. He wanted them to see he felt nothing. He wanted them to believe he was beyond human remorse. But the evidence crushed him. The Avia sneakers matched perfectly to the casts pulled from blood and dirt. Fingerprints tied him to stolen cars and ransacked homes. Survivors pointed directly at him, their voices trembling but certain. That's him. That's the man who broke into my home. The jury didn't need months. In 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The list of charges was a ledger of horror, each line representing a life destroyed. When the judge read the verdict, Ramirez smirked again, his arrogance intact to the last. During sentencing, he leaned into the microphone, his words chilling and deliberate. "I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells in us all." The courtroom shuddered. Survivors wept. Families cursed his name. But Ramirez only grinned wider. He wanted to go down as a monster, not a man. The judge sentenced him to death. 19 death sentences in all. A number meant not just to punish, but to make a statement. Ramirez would die in San Quentin's gas chamber, but death would not come quickly. Instead, he sat on death row for decades, shielded by the endless appeals of the justice system. Behind bars, he received letters from women who dreamed of marrying him. He smiled for photographs, flashing his rotten teeth, showing off the pentagram on his palm. The Night Stalker, even caged, knew how to keep his legend alive. For Detective Salerno, it was a bitter victory. The killings had stopped, yes. The city had exhaled. But every time Ramirez appeared in the papers, every time he smirked at the camera, Salerno felt the poison linger. The man was behind bars, but his myth had survived. And perhaps that was the true burden. Because when a city names its monster, When a city turns him into a headline, he never really dies. He stays, lurking in the collective memory, footsteps echoing long after the sneakers have rotted away. Ramirez had been captured in daylight, but the night he created still lived on. The Night Stalker never walked free again. Richard Ramirez rotted in a cell at San Quentin, his body aging, his health wasting under cancer until 2013, when death finally came. Not by gas chamber, not by execution, but quietly, from disease. For some, it felt like a cheat. For others, it was simply the end of a man who had once made an entire city tremble. But fear doesn't die with the man who causes it. Los Angeles still remembers. The survivors remember the smell of him, the sound of sneakers on their floors, the moment their prayers collided with the rasp of his voice. Swear to Satan. Detectives remember the plaster casts of Avia prints, the pentagrams drawn in lipstick, the axe embedded in a doorframe. Parents still tell their children to lock their windows at night, because what Ramirez left behind was larger than his crimes. He proved how fragile safety really is, that the walls of your home, the locks on your doors, the lights in your hallway, none of it can keep out the randomness of evil. He taught a city that fear itself can be a weapon sharper than any blade, and so the question lingers, even decades later. Was Richard Ramirez just one man, or was he a mirror? A reminder that in the dark, in the silence after midnight, evil does not need reason or pattern to knock at your door. The Night Stalker is dead, but the night itself remains.